Hey folks, so I'm Eric Bayruns Garcia, and I'll be giving this talk titled Belief Content and Rationality, Why Racist Beliefs Are Not Rational. So I have a few aims in this talk today. The first aim is to defend the view in epistemology called evidentialism. According to evidentialism, a subject is justified in her belief only if her evidence supports her belief. So, and I'm defending this against an attack by the moral encroachment theorists or moral encroachment folks or epistemologists who go in for moral encroachment, and they take their view to show that evidentialism is false because according to the moral encroachment folks, a subject's moral reasons can bear on what she should believe, right? And that's going to be, if true, rather it'll show that evidentialism is false. A second aim I have is I want to show that moral encroachment cases of simultaneously rational and racist beliefs do not obtain. That is, folks in the moral encroachment literature have pointed to cases where somebody holds a belief that is both racist and rational to motivate the view that evidentialism is false, right? So the fact that that belief is racist violates a moral norm, and therefore somebody shouldn't hold this belief, even though it's rational by evidentialism's lights. So I want to show that these cases that motivate moral encroachment don't obtain. I also want to diagnose a problem with the debate between evidentialists and moral encroachment folks or moral encroachers. Right, I'm going to say that they're not properly accounting for how context relates to the content of beliefs. But I'm saying that about both sides. Both the folks who have been defending evidentialism and the moral encroachment folks themselves just haven't been taking context into account in the way that I think they should, maybe with some exceptions. I'm also going to motivate that racist beliefs rely on their contexts for their content. And the basic idea here is that the history and current racial injustice that composes the context of US society kind of fills out or determines the content of racist beliefs or beliefs that involve race, right? We can have beliefs, and some of these beliefs involve content in the race and racial injustice domain. And I'm saying those kinds of beliefs depend on their context for their content. Okay, let me say something about this debate between the moral encroachment folks on the one hand and evidentialists on the other. So according to the moral encroachment thesis, as I already mentioned, moral reasons can bear on what a subject should believe, right? And a case that features prominently is this case with a subject named Spencer. It's also called the Black Diner case quite often. And this case goes like this. Imagine a subject named Spencer. He's a waiter, and he's been a waiter for a while, and he forms the belief that Black diners do not tip as much as white diners. And the way this case is construed is that he forms this belief on good evidence, right? Good evidence. He appeals to some sociological study also on top of his own personal experience as a waiter, right? There was some longitudinal study that does exist in the literature, sociological literature, but he's not motivated by any racist or negative racist animus, or anything like that. He holds the belief in good faith with respect to racial injustice, right? He holds a true belief, this is the way this case is construed, on good evidence and in good faith, right? If the evidence were to change, he would change his belief, right? He's not holding it for some other reasons that, for some racist reasons or something like this, right? But nonetheless, for the moral encroachment theorist, this belief seems racist because it attributes a negative feature to a non-dominant group. This belief violates a moral norm against holding racist beliefs. And certainly we shouldn't hold racist beliefs, right? And this is the moral encroachment theorist is appealing to. Thus, Spencer should refrain from holding this belief, even though it's true. And even though, and more importantly, it's formed on good evidence. So this is an outstanding belief by evidentialism's lights because it's not only true, but formed on good evidence. But it's nonetheless a racist belief and violates a moral norm. And therefore, Spencer should refrain from holding this belief because of this moral reason, this moral norm reason. And therefore, evidentialism is false because evidentialism is just the view that a subject should believe what her evidence supports. Moral reasons don't figure into what a subject should believe for the evidentialist. Okay, so this is the moral encroachment, let's call it a challenge to evidentialists or evidentialism as a view. Okay. So now, how am I going to defend evidentialism? Well, I'm going to use the following strategy. So I think if I show that beliefs such as Spencer's are evidentially unsupported, then cases such as Spencer's, that is race-involving cases, don't show that evidentialism is false because the evidence doesn't actually support these beliefs. It's a kind of straightforward strategy in a way, right? I'm just denying what the moral encroachment theorist is stipulating in a sense. Now, the moral encroachment thesis depends on there's this intuition that a set of beliefs can be simultaneously rational and racist, okay? So if I show that this intuition tracks something epistemically specious, not morally specious, then I will have explained away the conclusion that evidentialism is false and moral encroachment true. Right? This literature or this view, this moral encroachment view, really is relying on a kind of intuition that a reader will have when presented with this Spencer case. Right? And the moral encroachment theorist is saying, look, that intuition you have of wrongness, well, it's because this guy Spencer's holding a racist belief, even though it seems quite rational. Therefore, he shouldn't hold it if you're motivated to not be racist, or that is, Spencer should not hold it if these moral reasons obtain. Okay. So that's my strategy. Let me give you my basic argument. So first, sorry, folks, my computer's lagging a bit here. So I call beliefs like Spencer's seemingly rational racist beliefs. Why? Well, because they are only seemingly both rational and racist, not actually simultaneously rational and racist. If, and this is the argument, if seemingly rational racist beliefs involve evidentially unsupported content about how whites are superior to non-whites, then seemingly rational racist beliefs are not evidentially supported. So the burden is on me to show that P obtains, this premise obtains, that And really the important bit is I have to give you a plausible story about how these seemingly rational racist beliefs actually include evidentially unsupported content. Okay. And specifically the content that I'm going for is that these beliefs involve content that includes that whites are superior to non-whites. And that's false, of course. And I'm going to assume it's not evidentially supported. Okay. So the strategy is I'm going to show that P, and therefore C obtains, the conclusion obtains. I can conclude that seemingly rational racist beliefs are not evidentially supported. And here I'm assuming that content externalism about race and racial injustice beliefs is true. That is, there's this view about what determines the content of our beliefs, where what determines the content of our beliefs goes on outside of our heads. It's our context, it's the world out there. And then you can be a content internalist, but I'm not going for that. I'm assuming a content externalism, and I'll say more about that. But it's not a global or fully general content externalism. I'm just being a content externalist about race and racial injustice terms that would compose the beliefs in question here that the moral encroachment theorist is going to appeal to motivate their view. Okay. So let me tell you something about why these seemingly rational racist beliefs are, on my view, evidentially unsupported. Okay, so again, to motivate that seemingly rational racist beliefs involve evidentially unsupported content regarding how whites are superior to non-whites, I need to make plausible, render plausible that the racially unjust context of the US in which we are, many of the folks watching, maybe not all of you are in the US, but this could be true for the Americas, but I'm focusing on the context of the US. So I need to render plausible that the racially unjust context of the US determines the content of seemingly rational racist beliefs, this class of beliefs. So remember, Spencer's belief is that Black diners do not tip as much as white diners. Now, the content of this belief, I submit, is not exhausted by the strict denotation of this sentence, right? There's a strict denotation of this sentence. And I'm saying there's more content in here than what this arrangement of English words involves, right? We can analyze what things mean apart from their context, and that might be the strict denotation. But at the very least, I'm saying, look, the belief that Spencer has that Black diners do not tip as much as white diners is not exhausted by this arrangement of English words in this English sentence, right? When somebody thinks it. Here, I'm just invoking the idea that context matters in terms of content and meaning, right? This is a point that Tyler Burge made, Putnam and Stallmaker and other folks. But this point has been made by Linda Martin Alcoff, especially regarding race, right? Race terms are kind of very obvious, or good candidates, I should say, good candidates to get their content from the environment and the social practices that compose that environment. So let me give you a case without context. Suppose a man in a US crowd, a man tells a US crowd that US states should not have their right to manage their internal affairs abridged or overridden by the US government. Those familiar with how the US works and the history of political theory and philosophy will know this as the view that many call federalism, right? States have this right to restrict or not be interfered with by the federal government. in certain respects, right? So the content of this belief just involves, if we're just analyzing it without context, how states' rights should be understood to relate to the federal government's rights to interfere. Okay, let me give you that same case, but with the details filled in, the context filled in, and this is an actual case. So Ronald Reagan in 1980 very famously gave a speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where he endorsed, he said, "I'm pro states' rights." He endorsed states' rights. And he gave this speech to a crowd in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Now, an important thing about this context, apart from it being part of the Deep South, is that 16 years earlier, civil rights workers James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman were murdered by Klansmen in Philadelphia, Mississippi. On trial, the folks who murdered these civil rights workers, the Klansmen that were murdered them, they invoked the notion of states' rights to justify their defense of Southern white supremacy. And they were on trial in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Right, so this is a place where states' rights has been used in certain ways, likely going back definitely for a fact, going back hundreds of years to the beginning of the, at least to the early 1800s. But now let's suppose that Reagan believed his utterances pro-states' rights content. That is, he didn't just say it and merely utter it, but he actually believed the content, okay? And I think we don't even need to suppose that. The historical record clearly shows that Reagan believed many a racist thing. So now here's Southerners' linguistic practice, right? This practice that they used of using states' rights to refer to their supposed right to dominate and subjugate Black folks, right? That's what this term was used. Federalism is not what's being invoked. It's their supposed right to dominate, subjugate Black persons in the South. So this practice of using this federalism talk, right, or states' rights term over time in this context determines this use is what's determining the content of Reagan's belief and utterance, actually, but let's just focus on the belief. Okay, now let me give you another case to get at this view that I'm pushing. Suppose somebody claims in a Alabama Birmingham town hall, right? Somebody stands up and says, "I support states' rights." And then they follow that claim with, "I'm opposed to segregation." Well, in that case, I think the other town hall participants would take her to support either logically inconsistent states of affair, or at least things that are in tension, because the content of states' rights depends on the system of segregation and Jim Crow in the Southern US, right? These two claims, I support states' rights and I'm opposed to segregation, are in conflict or are inconsistent or are in tension because of how states' rights relates to the history of, say, segregation and Jim Crow and slavery and all of these other things that compose the history of the US and the practices that compose this history. Whereas if we just considered federalism, if states' rights just invoked federalism, then these two claims wouldn't be in conflict, in tension, or inconsistent. No, right? There would be nothing wrong. Federalism, you can support federalism and be opposed to segregation, and those would be completely compatible. But that's not what's going on, right? These were set in a certain context, and thus the context determines the content in such a way that these claims are incompatible of a sort. Okay. So now here I'm just trading on a kind of Wittgensteinian point about how utterance meaning depends on community or context. And Linda Martine Alcoff has said meanings and content are determined by use, either overt or covert ones, and use is always specific to context. Burge makes a similar point. Burge says, look, belief content depends on social linguistic practices, right? So he presents this arthritis case. He says, suppose a subject believes that he has arthritis in his thigh. Well, that belief is false. Why? Well, because folks in his community and our community as well don't use the term arthritis to refer to pains in thighs. We use it to refer to pains in joints. Now, if this subject lived in another world where folks in his community used the term arthritis to refer to pains in thighs and joints, then his belief would be true, but he doesn't live in that world, and thus his belief is false, and therefore the social linguistic practices that compose his context and society are determining the truth or falsity of his belief, right? Truth or falsity depends on context. And therefore, race terms like Black, white, indigenous clearly depend on context for content, no doubt, because these terms have been used over the course of US history in various ways. And one way is folks have made negative attributions where to Black, Indigenous, and Latinx persons in comparison to whites. So folks have referred to Black folks as enslaved, say in the 1800s. You don't need to look hard to see this claim made. And that claim, even though it was true, was often conveying the content that they were fit to be enslaved, that they ought to be enslaved. The same was true for indigenous folks when Columbus arrived. He made this exact claim. Or people have said Latinx persons have crossed the border without documents at a such and such degree or number, or that they live in first generation folks tend to live in homes that are a bit cramped. These are true in some sense, but those claims, these negative comparisons to whites, are conveying other things like that, say Latinx persons are constitutionally inferior to whites or something like that. And that's false, of course. So here the context is determining the content of negative attributions, such as these that compose these beliefs. And this is the kind of belief that Spencer has. So the content of Blacks do not tip as much as whites, where this is Spencer's belief, is not exhausted by what this arrangement of English words denotes. Just like Reagan in Philadelphia, Mississippi. So that whites rate higher on some metric of value in comparison to Blacks, that this kind of content has been used to convey the falsehood that Black folks are inferior to whites, right? Often over the history of the US, the pointing out or the attributing of these kinds of negative comparisons between persons of color and white folks are not merely conveying these attributions, but also conveying something else. And that something else is being conveyed because of how these attributions relate to the history of racial injustice, Jim Crow, slavery, indigenous genocide, and colonialism in the US. So I will stop there.